Hi, everybody. This is Dave Fusco here, and it's noon. We're going to get started here with today's HAX webinar, and we're going to talk about web components, data standards, and xAPI. And this is really, I want to keep this really informal, and I was thinking about how we would want to kind of run this webinar, and really this is about a way for me to share some of the things that I'm working on, we're working on here at Penn State, and not only in IST, but some other places and other colleges around the university. And I thought that I would kind of use this time to do a little bit of formal presentation of what I'm working on, and then open this up for kind of questions and comments. But as I'm going through this, by all means, feel free to ask questions along the way. Real quick, Tom, how's my sound check? Okay?
You are coming through clear on my end.
Awesome. I always like to do a quick sound check. So I have my desktop shared here. So I did put a really short PowerPoint presentation here together just to kind of show you the kinds of things that we're doing. I might actually leave it not full screen, but so the kind of the idea with this is that a lot of the things that drive what I do is looking at ed tech tools, education technology tools that really are built to help the learner. And what we see a lot today is a lot of the ed tech tools today are really built around helping the instructor, helping the professor. And not that that necessarily is a bad thing, but we see that a lot of the ed tech tools are not necessarily built around, looking at things from a learner-driven standpoint. And so a lot of the things that I look at and a lot of the things that we build are built around systems that are really empowering the user, the learner, in this construct, so that we can create systems that that instructors can build, but are really based around the learner in mind. And this is really kind of built around the premise that I try to look at things from building the persona of the learner, so that the learner can not only reflect upon themselves, but understand where they might be at as it relates to other people in their class, or other people that are participating in kind of whatever course or whatever activity that's happening. For those of you who don't know, there is a standard that came out here about 4 or 5 years ago now, that's called xAPI. And xAPI, you might have also heard it called Tin Can API. It stands for Experience API, and it's really a way for us to have a framework around quantifying and wrapping data around experiences that people have, not just learners. This is really big in human resources and performance tracking systems. But from an education standpoint, xAPI was really built around this idea that we can capture micro learning activities, right? Hence the X of xAPI. And there's a whole bunch of resources out there around xAPI. So the real kind of the basic pieces of xAPI revolve around, obviously, some kind of interaction that the learner has, whether it's with their phone or it could be a beacon, it could be a laptop, whatever, a website. Then we have this framework of capturing the actual data itself, and then we store that, we dump that data into what's called a learner record store, right? And this is different than an LMS or a CMS. This is a kind of another component of where we store learning record kinds of activities, right? So the idea around this is that there's this core idea of an actor, a verb, and an object, such that this actor does something and interacts with some object. Very basic premise of an xAPI statement is built around this, learner does something with something, right? There's also other kinds of auxiliary data that you can store. If it's an assessment piece, you want to find out did they pass that particular assessment? What did they score? Who was, what was the context? Was it with a particular instructor? And then other kinds of extensions with that data. It's very, it's very structured in how we look at this from an actor-verb activity. And you might ask yourself, well, why do I need xAPI? Why don't I just kind of do this myself with whatever data structure I have? You can certainly do that, but as more systems become xAPI compliant, you'll find that your data can then mesh with other data points that are also conforming to this data standard. If you kind of look at the infrastructure needed, obviously, you can have this built with something like a learning locker, learning record store. You can centralize this on a server and then access this xAPI data in a number of different ways. What we've been working on here is really looking at a HAX framework with the premise that the data are kept local first. You can centralize them if you want to, you can sync them if you want to, but the idea is that the data remains local first, which really adds a lot of speed for this kind of an application framework. This is all built around web components, and hopefully you got a chance to look at the 2 videos that I sent you earlier this week from Brian Olendijk, and that really hopefully gave you some context around what HAX is and what web components are. And I definitely am not going to do any kind of justice for web components. It would take a pretty long time to kind of cover that, but you kind of understand that what I'm showing you today is built around this idea of web components, right? We're also looking at how we can use this framework to tie in with other systems. And this is, again, built around open standards, open web components, not taking the approach of kind of a vendor in a box kind of approach, which was what a lot of ed tech solutions do. The idea behind this kind of this data framework that I've built is really with the understanding that we have this xAPI data standard as a background. Actor does something with something. And the idea that I'm really interested in doing is building upon this part right here at the top middle, which is this web component emitting data. And so what I've done is I've built this PouchDB web component, and what it does is it listens for web components to emit some kind of data. PouchDB as a web component listens for that data, stores it locally, and then later on, if you want to, we can have it so that this object request from a web component can then ask the PouchDB web component to then say, hey, give me some of your data, and then I'm going to visualize this, right? And so what I want to kind of just stop here is and if you kind of go back to my PowerPoint here, the whole premise with this is that the things that we're building are like Lego blocks. And if you kind of think about the original design of Lego blocks, they haven't changed from their original design. And the kinds of things you can build with them are possible because of their component nature, right? And so this idea is that we should be able to build in our building these web components that emit data. And then you'll see that, on this screen alone, we have a web component that emits data. We have a PouchDB web component that listens for the data. And then instead of wrapping the visualization up inside this Pouch database, we can break it off into its own web component. So you kind of, it's this building block approach of having, lots of different little pieces that are built together to build this up. Okay?
Dave, can you hear me? Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, by all means, please.
Sorry, this is Kent. I just wanted to ask, I don't know much about how browsers allow for, or how this framework allows for local storage. I mean, like I know of cookies. I don't really know how they work and things like that. But can you talk a little bit about how, like, what you're creating and how it tells someone's remote computer, and they might be on an aircraft carrier out in the middle of India, or you know, somewhere else out in the middle of the heartland, how does their computer create this PouchDB web component and store the data for later retrieval?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kent. Very good question. So the idea around this is that when you build a web component and you invoke it inside your HTML, and I'm gonna, I'll kind of go through a little bit of this today as much as you want. As an example, I have this multiple choice web component. I can invoke that onto a web page very simply put by just having this as a tag that points to that specific web component. And the good thing is that when you render these systems locally, once this HTML is rendered locally in your browser, the data storage of what I'm using for this in particular, you actually said the name of it, which is called local storage. And local storage is a browser-based storage mechanism such that if you never clear your cache and you consistently use the same browser for that activity, that data remains persistent. And it just so happens that this PouchDB leverages that local storage, and I can store data inside that like you would a cookie, which makes it exceptionally fast. And you'll see that here in a couple minutes. Does that help, Ken?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of, if you kind of go back to this older mentality of, your typical LAMP stack of having kind of this centralized data storage, which you can certainly do with this. The solution that I've built has a remote sync capability with it, but your traditional web services are built around a mean stack or a LAMP stack or some kind of, remote, come and get me, and then I'm going to deliver it to you stack. This web component idea is really built around the idea of having components that are really self-contained, and they're contextualized, and that they kind of know about all the things that can happen to itself, if that makes sense. Whoops. Mess up my code here. Okay. Tom and I were just talking, don't change your live demo code right before your demo. Good question, Ken. Does anybody else have any other kind of questions along those lines? Like, why am I doing this versus other kind of frameworks or stacks? Okay, I'm going to keep moving on. If those of you have kind of done remote sessions, you don't want to have too much dead air. So let me just kind of show you a demo that I put together for us here. And you'll notice, I'm going to jump back and forth here just a little bit. You'll notice that this particular page, basically all I needed to do to invoke multiple choice was to literally use this multiple choice web component. And what I've done is inside this web component, I've wired it so that it will grab certain pieces of data that I can pass over and store eventually into as an xAPI statement, right? And so the idea is that for any given component, if you can snag the data, right, that's specific to that web component, like multiple choice, you can pass it over to my web component that will then store it, and then later I'll visualize it, okay? So very simply put, I can invoke as many multiple choice components as I want here. And you'll notice what happens here is that, and this is just a very simple proof of concept. You'll see over here in my console, every time I invoke a particular multiple choice component, what ends up happening is that, let me move this over, is that you can see that inside, these are individual PouchDB entries, so to speak, right? These are records within PouchDB, which is stored within local storage. You'll see that this is my embedded xAPI statement that's embedded within my local storage. Now you might be, again, go back to, well, why did I use xAPI? Why didn't I just dump whatever I wanted in there. Now, the cool thing with this is that if you work with other xAPI compliant products, I can extract this and integrate it with other xAPI product or data and products or whatever. And now I have this seamless framework of data that I can use across multiple platforms, right? You know, and down here, I have another multiple choice quiz that I can keep interacting with, and every time I interact with that, it cuts a new xAPI record that we see here, right? Before I go on to the visualization piece, does anybody have any questions about that part?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I've got another one.
Very important.
As I see that you can get into these records, how secure are they? Like, could I, if I was taking your class, could I go back in and root around through my browser and get access to these and maybe even change some of the data? Or
Yeah, could. Yeah. So can you individually access your own data? Absolutely, right? And so the idea is that, you know, other people can't necessarily get access to your data unless they obviously got access to your hard drive. But this is not encrypted. It's not, you know, securely stored. Could they change it? Yes. And so, you know, we have to layer on that kind of that validity aspect to this, you know, once we get to the point where we're going to store this centrally. If you kind of look at this, the perspective of storing this locally goes back to my third slide, which is around the premise that this is built for students to understand their own progress. This isn't necessarily
right.
to report to the professor what a student's doing necessarily, although we could eventually get there. But this particular model is around helping students show their own progress as they move through learning objects.
So they don't really have a benefit of rooting. So for one, they may not even know that this is happening on the back end. Like, I would have no clue. But
Right.
even if someone knew, they wouldn't really benefit from messing with this data.
That's right. Unless
except to learn from like how what you're doing and like how it's working, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, can you game the system? And I mean, ultimately, I think if you design the system incorrectly, you know, you could, if you dump this data to a central place and you're like tracking all of your students' success and you don't validate your data, then obviously students can game it. But the premise is around helping students help themselves. And ultimately, my goal with this is to have students share their data with each other so that, you know, if I'm progressing at a certain rate on a certain quiz, I'd like to know how I compare to other students, not necessarily, you know, as a kind of a record of academic progress. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Other questions so far? Okay, so, you know, I kind of scroll down here, and if you kind of go back to my code here, you know, I looked at multiple choice and how I could leverage the multiple choice web component. I did the same thing with self-check. Self-check is another web component that we use for assessment purposes, and it's really just did a student interact with this literal self-check, right? Did they read this and recognize that they did this? And you have to kind of recognize that this kind of breaks your traditional assessment type framework. This is about looking at and tracking user progress, user activities, so that we can share back to them what they're doing. This isn't like a way to replace how we write quizzes. This is about looking at interactions of a particular object. So in this case, we kind of look at, did they actually do the self-check or not? I mean, it's a very simple binary, right? And so what you'll see here is that if I interact with these different components here, you know, every time I select this, it just tracks that I did that, right? Again, you might think, well, what's the big deal here? Well, it's not a big deal necessarily by itself, but if you take this data and you combine it with other kinds of data points, then it becomes interesting, right? Then I can visualize this, right? And what you see here is basically just me visualizing whenever a person interacts with a web component. In this case, it's quiz 6. I moved it down so you could just kind of see what happens here, right? And it dynamically changes. So if you can imagine, a student is at a learning website, and up in the upper right-hand corner or whatever, pick a corner of choice, right? You kind of have this dashboard that has this running total of progress of whatever objects that you want to have interactive, kinds of data on. So yesterday, Mike Potter and I were looking at this. Here's his GitHub page if you want to give him some shout outs here. He and I were looking at this yesterday, and we said, well, what other kinds of things could we tie this into, right? And some of these things you might think, well, again, it's pretty simple, but he put this together, and we're looking at, here's just, basic astronomy page. And so here I am, I'm a student, and I'm kind of walking through this content, and I'm kind of looking around, looking at this different content. And then at the very end, and you'll kind of notice down here in the console, we have xAPI statements being generated. And what we find is that this dashboard then becomes a little more interesting, right? My dashboard had quiz and self-check interactions, and this one shows you your page views, right? If you want to find out, how many times did a particular student, look at this page, and, you can add timers into this and find out how long they spent on the page and all that kind of stuff. But again, this is a lot of proof of concept kinds of ideas so that we can start to do more of this kind of visualization with different kinds of objects, different kinds of web components, so that we can make interesting visualizations. Because usually the conversations I've had with people with this is, let's make some interesting kind of use case studies of how we would do this. And like every time I would ask like a colleague of mine, what would you want to visualize, right? It's different than the answer that maybe a student gives me. And so I'm trying to look at this from a student perspective of how we can look at this data visually on kind of on their behalf, right? So these are the kinds of things that we can start to look at. So,
quick question, Dave. It's Mike Bartolacci.
Yeah, sure. Hey, Mike.
With the analytics built into Canvas, occasionally I have concern about a student who says, "Oh, I've been putting in a lot of time," and I go in and look, and there's just the opposite. At least, what limited view you can get out of Canvas. Do you see this given a much better granularity than for that type of purpose? Although you say it's being stored strictly with the student, could it be made available to the instructor, or the student would have to okay the instructor seeing this sort of information?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Really good questions. I get that a lot. So let me kind of address the Canvas versus the other question. I think I'll do the latter first, which is, my idea around this design is that student analytics should be shared if a student wishes to share them with their instructor for the purpose of, helping be a better learner, right? I'm of that mindset that, we can set that up for sure. To answer your question, can we sync this data? Yeah, I mean, I can literally sync this data with a remote server by literally turning this on right here. This piece of code, I literally just have to, uncomment this, set up a receiving server, and my data will be synced automatically with this component. So yeah, we can sync this data for the instructor to see it. To your first point, this is obviously not in Canvas. It's not written in Canvas. I'm not saying that it couldn't be. You'd have to kind of talk to Instructure, right? The Canvas people. This is really built around this idea of having this kind of a learning system built by instructors using components like this. And that's really kind of what we're working on, right? There are other, Eberly already has this running. A&A, Arts and Architecture, has this running, this system. And so there are other colleges that are doing this, which was kind of be my question at some point, but I can ask it now. If any of you are looking or would be interested in doing some of this, let me know. And, we can certainly look at how these things could be built. The infrastructure's already there. I'm adding components as we speak to do this kind of stuff. I don't know if that answered your question, Mike.
Yes, it did. I would not have expected this functionality. I meant outside of Canvas, that this would give me much better granularity than Canvas probably ever can. So it would be worth implementing this, and developing, something that could be implemented, go to this link for this particular quiz versus having a Canvas quiz.
Yeah, I try, when I very much support the use of Canvas as a university resource. We use it a lot here in IST. And whenever I have this talk, I don't ever want it to sound like it's an anti or non-Canvas discussion. It's not. In fact, I think if, learning systems should really be built as open as possible, in a secure way to share this kind of data. So I'm not saying that this would replace Canvas. I think you said it best, right? This could be a way to have an auxiliary resource to Canvas, right? Yeah. So yeah, this is actually already in production with several other colleges, and I'm really at a point now where I've always really been interested in data visualization when it comes to providing learning analytics on behalf of the learner itself, right? So I really found this a really good way. Plus, for me, to be honest, I mean, it's given me a way to really keep up to date with, some more modern web technologies, and it's really cool stuff. Other questions? This is real informal, so if you have any comments or questions, just jump in here.
From a student perspective, I'm trying to project myself. To be honest, it's been a little while since I've been an enrolled student, but with the huge variety of courses and the huge variety of different activities, whether it's watching a video or reading something, doing a self-check quiz, etc., all these activities that we as educators have our learners doing, I think something that I would want to know is, what is the most effective things for me, not just for what a designer or the faculty member thinks I should be doing, to learn and do well in this course. And so I'm kind of curious about like how that might look using this information. I mean, I could see how, again, these xAPIs could be sort of tracking my progress and what I'm doing, but maybe somehow comparing that to historical and, like you said, maybe even current data with other students, and just give me a sense of like, yeah, man, I know you're spending a lot of time watching these videos, but you better talk with your faculty member because this time on task is not the most effective for you. Maybe you should go and read the text or whatever, right? I mean, I don't know how it would tell me that or how it would get that information, but that for me as a learner, I think would be really good to know. Or, you know what? Hey, I think I'm spending a lot of time. I'm putting an hour in every week on the course, but it's like, actually, everyone who's doing quote unquote well in this course is putting in 5 hours or something.
Yeah. I've done several different versions of this talk, and another version I've done is kind of layering learning objectives on top of xAPI statements. And from from an LD perspective, you can appreciate that you could have objectives that are tied to a course that are then connected to xAPI statements, which you can say students who do these kinds of activities well or not are tied to these learning objectives. And there are actually ways that you can map that out between those. And so that next higher level order of thinking about how we analyze this data is really kind of the next piece after once I get this done, which I'm pretty much there. I mean, I'm done in the fact that I have this built. Once I now can get people that are building these learner components, right? Multiple choice, video, whatever. Once I get them to emit the data and I can capture it, then we can really start to do some cool things with analytics of what you're talking about, Ken.
That's cool. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm of the mindset if I can get people that are building these things to think about the data in a specific format like this, instead of having data being kind of thrown out all over the place, we can have a standard like this that not only talks to what I've built, but also talks with other xAPI compliant systems, which they're becoming more and more. I wouldn't say every day, but they're becoming more and more as we speak. Then we can not only just look at our data, we can look at other cross-platform data. So let me kind of ask you, so Kent has given us some ideas of some use cases, and Mike did as well. What are some use cases of what you'd like to see in a dashboard? Now let's pretend that not necessarily from a learner perspective, or you could do it from a learner perspective, but what do you think this dashboard ought to look like? Instead of obviously just what quiz did you take, but what, from a learner perspective, what do you think, what are some interesting things that you think would make up a dashboard?
Oh, sorry. No, Mike, after you.
I was just going to say, I don't think students are aware of the learning objectives. I know everybody's supposed to put it in their syllabi, but as someone who spent umpteen years in school, I wasn't always aware of how certain modules in a given course lined up with the learning objectives for the course. To see, okay, I just went through this module and oh, that corresponds to this learning objective. So then if I can get a sense, that this was really important, this is a listed learning objective for the course, and if I'm still clueless, I may have to do some remediation.
Okay, I'm just taking some notes here as I know it's recorded, but I'm taking notes too. I think there was one other person that was going to jump in there.
Oh, yeah. So one thing I would like to see in the dashboard is, I mean, Kent kind of touched on it and you touched on it, was comparing yourself to other people. So when Kent mentioned that, like, a student who spends like an hour on the course material and their perception of how well they do compared to others, having some sort of like comparison graph or like a side-by-side like bar graph of like the average student, or like what could even like further than that is like, what would the A student look like compared to me? What would like a B student look like compared to me? And then like that like third option being like the average kind of like mid-range student. Just so like, as I guess like from a learner's perspective, it's like easier to gauge that like what would be expected for whatever outcome I hope to get by the end of the course.
Okay. I guess my other question is, I've been talking with some other people here about this, and I guess my thought is that we can have faculty help build some of these things. And I guess my question is, and I'm talking, literally kind of building components here. And I guess the question is, do you think there's enough of an interest from faculty, within IST or not, to want to help build components like this? Or do you think that that's maybe not feasible? Or do you think faculty just would be interested in using them? I'm trying to, any input that you have of, do you think faculty in general would want to help build these, or kind of just use them?
I would probably say a little of both.
Okay. Okay.
At least I can't speak for UP faculty. I mean, Berks faculty would probably be very interested in this, especially the ability. I mean, as you create an object here, you can reuse it again and again and again in different courses.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that reusability and not reinventing the wheel aspect makes it very, very attractive.
Okay. I know everybody has lots of things going on. I didn't expect like 80 people to like throw their hand up and go, oh yeah, I got plenty of time to throw into this. But I'm just kind of, I was sitting a couple weeks ago and I thought, you know what, I need to just start sharing some of this a little more and see what other people interest might be. Todd said, would these additional dashboards be helpful for students, or should be utilized Canvas more? Yeah, I think, so the idea is having a tool directing students to dashboards, but should this be in Canvas so they have one source of truth? Well, I think there's different kinds of thought on that, right? You can have kind of that centralized version approach, which is the ultimate, you could say, well, is Canvas the ultimate record keeper of progress? I mean, that's one approach. I think it kind of, it doesn't really tie into the notion that you can build really fast web components that are done locally in a browser. If you kind of go out and look at how web components are being used today, they're wicked fast. I mean, the response of components and websites is just unbelievably quick in response. And not everywhere in the world has high-speed internet either, right? So if you kind of look at this from a digital divide perspective, I'm not saying it's not a good idea, Todd. I'm just kind of saying that there's pros and cons to the different models. I've actually talked with some people about Canvas. They've looked at an equivalent called Caliper, which is like xAPI, but to my knowledge, I don't think they have that enabled yet. I apologize for this light. It's like blinding me. But so I think that it's possible to look at that, but if you kind of go back to that, this is a learner-focused approach. It's just a different model, of how I've kind of view this, but yeah.
So Dave, another thing that I think that these analytics could provide is the ability to adapt the student content depending on how they're moving through it. Like the easiest example is showing, that your progress through the chapters, marking off the different lessons as you go, and then indicating, it took you a little longer in this lesson compared to the others, or, during the self-check evaluation at the end of this lesson, you didn't do as well as you would probably want, so maybe it's marked in yellow. And maybe if you have a lesson that's marked in yellow, then we can load some additional modules to help you out there.
Thanks. And that's the guy I was just talking about here a little earlier. So thanks for your help on all this. And Mike is like advanced wizard master with web components. So I'm learning a lot from him. He's really been a lot of help in moving this forward. So I appreciate it. Yeah. So if you kind of, I know what maybe some of you are thinking, like, why are you even worrying about this? Why are you building this? Why don't you just let the people at Canvas just build this eventually? And it comes back to that idea that, you know, this next generation of web design, website creation is really built around web components. So if we can get people that are building these components now to think about this for the future, we can emit data and capture it while we're building it. So yeah.
One follow-up comment on that. I went to my first and only InstructureCon, which is a Canvas sort of vendor-led event, and there I learned, and it never dawned on me before, that they call it Canvas for a reason. They see their mission as creating not a blank canvas, but a canvas by which other developers, companies create additional features that they want and plug in. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if this is something that people want to see, people shouldn't wait just for Canvas to do it, because there's a very good chance that Canvas may not.
Oh, you're dropping off a little bit, Kent.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. I don't know if you can still hear me, but yeah, I guess the point is you may not want to wait for someone else to try and do this. That if we want to do this, if this is something we want, we should try and make it happen, I guess. Yeah, again, this is I'm not saying this is not an anti-Canvas statement. It is and this is Canvas kind of just can't open the lid to let everybody into their box, right? To write and change code. And a lot of Canvas, like whether it's Blackboard or Moodle or whatever, well, Moodle's a bad example, but the closed box systems, a lot of their integration is wrapped around LTI or APIs, and which again is fine from a large scale enterprise system, but from let's build a system that's more learner focused, the tools are definitely there, and there's really, this is all open source. All of the stuff we're building is all on our GitHub pages, and so it's absolutely available for people to use and build. Next time I do one of these, I am not sitting next to my shiny, super bright sun here. So, well, it's yeah. I was just gonna say, it's like 1:45 now, and I didn't have you. This wasn't like a webinar. I wasn't like, it's funny. I've done this talk a bunch of different times, different venues, and different, depending on who's in the room, I'll get somebody to come up. They'll be like, so where can I buy this? Or when can I buy this? Or do you have somebody that's selling this? And it's like, no, I'm not selling this. Like that's, the point is that I'm not selling this. So it's kind of funny. This is maybe a different webinar than maybe some you might have seen on some other things. This was just me sharing what I'm doing, and just to kind of reach out and see what other people might be interested in doing together. Okay, well, with that, I'm gonna wrap it up. I'm gonna just, you're welcome to hang out. I'll see if anybody wants to talk about anything else. And but thanks for coming. I'll send the recording out to some other people, and let me know if you have any questions or if you want to work together. Mike, you and I can talk about Berks and how we can get you guys working on this with us, and we'd be happy to help you going on this. So
absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Hope you have an awesome day. Thanks for coming.